You ever stop and think about how a massive country, a democracy with millions of people, actually makes a huge, life-altering decision? I mean, it's not just one person snapping their fingers. It's this complex, sometimes dramatic process. And today, we are going to pull back the curtain on how power really works by following the story of one single, incredibly controversial piece of paper that absolutely rocked a nation.
Our whole story kicks off right here with this kind of cryptic-looking code, Office Memorandum number 36012/31/90. On August 13, 1990, the government of India put this order out. At first glance, it looks like any other government circular, barely a page long, something you'd probably just toss aside. But this piece of paper, this was about to change everything.
And honestly, saying it became a source of controversy is putting it so mildly. This little document wasn't just some boring administrative paperwork. No, it ignited an absolute firestorm of debate, protests, and legal battles that raged for years. It really tested the very machinery of India's democracy.
Okay, but before we get into all that drama, let's just quickly break down what an Office Memorandum, or an OM, even is. The easiest way to think about it is like a huge company-wide memo from the CEO, except here, the company is the entire country. It's the government's official way of saying, all right, everyone, listen up. This is the new policy, and this is how we're going to do it.
So, what was the big decision in this OM? It all came down to this one number, 27%. The order announced that from that day forward, 27% of all job openings in the central government would be reserved for a group they called the Socially and Educationally Backward Classes, or SEBCs. This wasn't just a small tweak. This was a truly monumental shift in public policy.
So, that leads us to the really big question, right? Who actually has the authority to make a call this big? A decision that's going to directly shape the careers and futures of millions of people. Well, as you're about to see, the answer is not nearly as simple as you might think.
Now sure, some officer from the Department of Personnel and Training put his signature on the paper, but he was just the final link in a very, very long chain. Think of it this way. He was the guy who hit send on an email that was written, debated, and approved by the entire board of directors. The real decision came from the absolute highest levels of government, from the most powerful political leaders in the country. That officer was just carrying out their order.
And these powerful decision-makers, they have a name. They belong to a branch of government we call the executive, and their job is literally right there in the name. They execute the policies and the laws of the country. They're the ones responsible for the day-to-day business of running the government, of turning ideas and laws into action.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This is how the executive is actually built. It's split into two key parts. On one side, you've got the political executive. These are the leaders we vote for, right? The prime minister, the cabinet ministers. They're in charge for a fixed term. But then you have the permanent executive. These are the civil servants, the bureaucrats. They're appointed, not elected, and they stick around no matter who wins the next election. They provide that crucial expertise and continuity that keeps the whole government machine running.
So, in the story we're following, it was the political side, the political executive that took the lead. The decision to go ahead with this 27% reservation was formally made by the Prime Minister at the time, VP Singh, and his core team of top ministers, which we call the Union Cabinet. They made the big call, and then it was up to the permanent executive, the departments, to figure out how to put it all into practice.
But a decision like this, one this massive, it doesn't just pop up out of thin air. To really get why the cabinet made this choice when they did, we have to rewind the clock. We've got to go back more than a decade to where this whole idea was born, in the arena of public debate and political promises. And as you can see from this timeline, this was anything but a sudden move. This was a decade in the making. It all started way back in 1979 with something called the Mandal Commission. They were given this enormous job, identify the socially backward classes and recommend steps for their advancement. A year later, they dropped the report, and at its heart was this bombshell recommendation for a 27% reservation. For the next 10 years, that idea was a political hot potato, debated over and over again in Parliament. And then, finally, in 1989, a political party made implementing that report a central promise of their election campaign. They won, and that promise set the stage for our entire story. And that long 10-year debate, that perfectly shows the role of our second key institution, the legislature, which in India is the parliament. The best way to think of it is as the nation's town square. It's where the representatives we elect all come together to debate,
to argue, to challenge the government. It was the constant discussion and pressure inside these walls that kept the model report on the political map for a full decade.
Okay, so after a decade of debate in the legislature, the executive finally made its move. But that was not the end of the story. Not even close. In fact, it was the beginning of a national firestorm. The country just erupted, and the conflict got so intense it had to be settled by our third and final key institution.
The reaction was immediate and it was fierce. On one hand, you had many people who saw this reservation as a historic step towards social justice, a way to give a fair shot to communities that had been held back for centuries. But on the other hand, you had many others who felt it was deeply unfair, that it was denying opportunities to people based on their caste, not their merit. The country was deeply divided.
So when you have a fight this big, with two sides so passionate and so divided over what the government has done, where can you possibly go for an answer? You go to the judiciary. As you can see on the slide, this is the system of courts. And what's so critical is that they are independent from the politicians and from the bureaucrats. Their job, their only job, is to interpret the law and the Constitution. They act as the ultimate impartial referee in the nation's biggest fights.
And just as you'd expect, this order was challenged in court almost immediately. The Supreme Court, the highest court in the country, bundled all the different cases together into one massive, landmark hearing. 2 years later, in 1992, they delivered their historic verdict. They declared that the government's order was fundamentally valid, but, and this is a hugely important but, they added a condition. They told the government to modify the order to make sure that the well-to-do people within these backward classes, these so-called creamy layer, were excluded from the benefits. That verdict basically settled the legal fight, and a modified policy was finally put in place the next year.
All right, so let's just take a breath and recap what we've seen. We've watched three incredibly powerful institutions at work. The legislature debated the idea for a decade. The executive made the final call, and the judiciary stepped in to resolve the massive conflict that followed. But that leaves a pretty big question. Why? Why have this complicated, often really slow, and overlapping system in the first place? While the answer gets to the very heart of democracy, it's a system of checks and balances. This slide lays it out perfectly. Each institution has its own unique and separate job. The legislature debates and makes the laws, the executive decides and implements them, and the judiciary reviews everything and settles disputes. This whole separation is designed for one absolutely critical reason: to make sure that no single person or group can ever get too powerful. They're all constantly watching and limiting each other. Now, you could look at all this and say, wow, that system seems really inefficient. It creates delays, it causes complications. But here's the thing. Those delays and complications, they're actually features, not bugs. The process provides all these opportunities for people to be consulted, for ideas to be debated, for decisions to be reviewed. It makes it really hard to just rush a bad idea into law and ensures that major policies are looked at from every single angle.
And that leaves us with a final, really powerful thought to chew on. The story of this one-page document was a journey that took over a decade. It involved all three branches of government and pushed the country into a crisis. It was messy, it was slow, and it was incredibly divisive, but it was also democratic. So the real question for us is this. In a world that always wants instant results, are we willing to accept the slow, difficult, and complicated work of democracy? Is it possible that all that friction we just saw in this story isn't a weakness at all, but the very thing that keeps the entire system from flying apart?